Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where this week you can get 50%, that's 50, or just half if you prefer, off select gaming supplies, including some of our most iconic sleeves, playmats, deck boxes, and more from across the years. That's all this week until Sunday, February the 6th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time over at StarCityGames.com/sale. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 42 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with iRelax, and this week we are going back to the future, I suppose, because the long wait is finally over. It is preview season once again.
Yes, but it's preview season for Kamigawa, so we've waited like 3 months, but also like 18 years.
Or I don't know what it is canonically. Is it like 1,000 years, 2,000 years? It really is a big leap forward in human progress here.
It's, let's see, if I can piece this together, it's like multiple thousands, I think, in story time, because the Kamigawa stuff was set thousands of years in the past when it was set thousands of years in the past. Anyways, we can talk about that on a different podcast.
There's some kind of weird multiplier effect going on there. But yeah, we will put the work in and do our research before our next lore segment sometime in the future. For now, though, we have a lot of previews to get stuck into. And you won't have to wait too long for those, because we do always like to start with the results here from the weekend's tournaments. And we only have one set of results because the Saturday challenge was not posted as far as any of us can tell. And so Ari has done some sleuthing and managed to piece together some parts of that. And there are still some interesting storylines to tease out there.
Yeah, so my understanding is I think they added like a third challenge for another format and it broke everything. But fortunately, we have 2 of the Saturday challenge members posting that they top 8'd. And from the results, we can actually, I think, derive 3 other decks at the top 8. So,
yeah, there was, I think, there was the Vintage Showcase Challenge, and then just a regular Vintage Challenge that was meant to be replaced, just materialized in the platform anyway, and that opened up a rift in the space-time continuum or something.
Yeah, the Magic Online scripts are doing their best, but there's only so much they can do.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, we have some familiar faces in this Saturday top 8, and they're familiar because they are also in the Sunday top 8, or the Sunday, yeah. So we have Laplacian, a familiar face from many challenge results in the past, with Old Faithful here in Oswald Hammer, and then Respect the Cat, who was playing this, I guess Jeskai Control is a fair moniker here because it is a mostly Azorius control deck, but the red cards are pulling some heavy lifting too.
Oh, I think that you lined up a different deck. I had Respect the Cat on Jun Saga.
Oh, wow. I don't want to...
Zurio is the winner. Respect the Cat was top 8 with Jun Saga. There we go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, don't want to slander them by putting them on a totally different deck here. But is this the new twist on Jun Saga with Elvish Reclaimer and a bunch of other new innovations? Or are they going back to, I guess, like September 2021 at this point?
They have a second Pyrite Spellbomb instead of the 4th Mishra's Bauble. But yeah, this is just old school Jun Saga. Their Twitter posts in addition to these challenge top 8s imply that they've been trophying a lot with it as well. So they appear to be I didn't look at the player history, but they appear to be quite the prolific Jun Saga aficionado.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that deck has been popping up a little more recently, revitalized in some corners by this move towards Elvish Reclaimer, but the classic build still doing decently as well, and potentially some new additions from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty to spice that up as well. And then I don't know if you would call this a comeback for the Hammer decks, but I guess you can call it that because this is the first time in a while that we've seen those consistently putting up top 8 results there.
Yeah, I do think that the 4-color decks moving back to Ragavan helped them a decent amount. So I've been spending some time just like scouting around and trying to figure out what the deal with the Ragavan stuff is. And it does feel like it is really, really like, I mean, I'm going to say something that sounds really obvious and dumb, but like if your opponent's not blocking Ragavan, it's really, really good. And it's really, really good. Backing it with Counterspell and the 4-color stuff feels, I still haven't quite figured out how to articulate why, but it feels really different than what the red-black deck is doing. Some of it might be the whole like well, if your 4-color deck has Ragavan in it and they put Lightning Bolt in their deck for game 2 and then they just like draw it and you don't have Ragavan, that's really bad for them. Some of it might be like that lineup, but I think that there's also some of the like borrowed tech from the Murktide decks where you're lining up Ragavan plus Counterspell, which is really powerful in its own right. And also just like the 4-color deck uses the mana a lot better than the Rakdos decks and also tends to cast its opponent's cards a little better. So it just felt like the Ragavans in that deck were doing more work than the usual Ragavan, but it's hard. I'm not entirely sure why, but that's like my first impressions of like what the difference is.
Speaking of Ragavan, we have also seen that card pop up in the third pillar of the format in the form of the Hammer decks, where that red splash for sometimes some other cards like Magnetic Theft or Galvanic Blast, but the headline act here really is Ragavan. And in a deck where if your opponent is not killing your creatures, then you are off to the races and usually doing some pretty absurd things. And if they are killing your creatures, this is yet another must-kill one-drop to pave the way for your Pure Steel Paladin, your Stoneforge Mystic, and so on. Have you had the chance to mess around with that at all?
I haven't. I think some of that has a similar flavor to what's going on with the reason people aren't playing Nettle System in the deck, which is like, if the broad hammer strategy is good, it self-cannibalizes all the like Ragavans and Nettlesys out of itself because they're worse in the mirror than just like the default stock list.
That's interesting. So maybe if the consensus seems to be that Hammer is or should be on the decline, then if you think that you're a step ahead of the curve there, or that the consensus there is misplaced, then that might actually be the perfect window to show up with your Ragavan Hammer deck and capitalize on that lack of the mirror. But I think Hammer has proven itself enough over the past few months that I think the default state should be you expect to see Hammer unless the format is actively hostile to it, as opposed to some of these second-tier strategies where, yeah, if it's well-positioned for that weekend, then it will show up, but you wouldn't expect to see it just penciled in for a few copies at least.
Yeah, I mean, even, we said this, but it was really weird that, like, there was, one or two challenges where there was not a Hammer deck in the top 16, because even when it wasn't top 8ing, there was just, 6 decks in these top 32s, and it was still putting up a solid metagame presence. So, yeah, even when it's not winning a lot, it's still very present at the top tables, and you still very much have to, win against it to get to the finals of an event.
Absolutely. And so rounding out that Saturday challenge, we have unnamed players on Team of Cascade, Grixis Shadow, and Scales. Not sure exactly which color combination there or the specifics of that build. But moving across to the Sunday challenge that we do have the results for, we see once again the Plashjan on Oswald Hammer, and for the first time, in second place, Kate _ on Oswald Hammer, featuring an interesting sideboard card here in Cameo of False Hope, which you look at that and you think, all right, this opens up this interesting, unique angle of you loop it with Lurus against some other creature decks, and that locks them out of the game, or maybe it has some applications against, you get paired against Infect or something, and they really hate to see that. As it turns out, Cameo of False Hope is an apt moniker, because Kate did confirm on Twitter that she never brought that card in or resolved it in a game in the challenge. So don't read too much into that one, maybe.
Yeah, Lurus is the best Dividing Grace in the format, so just wanted to let all the Martyr players out there know that. But yeah, Cameo of False Hope, sadly not showing up. I do want to point out that Lapse Legend had, so looking at the results that he posted, one Bitter Blossom in the sideboard of his deck on Saturday, and that went up to a 2-copy sideboard of it, plus all the Dark Confidants. So really leaning into the 2-drops in the sideboard to kind of carry in the more interactive matchups.
Yeah, when they inevitably top 8 this coming Saturday, we'll see just how many Bitter Blossoms end up in the 75 there. But that card, I think, it makes sense if what you're targeting is these base black midrange decks, where if you can expect a Fairy token to line up well against either Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler just threatening to trade, or against Death Shadow as a force field sometimes, then that card can buy you a lot of time or be this game-winning threat by itself, as opposed to, when that was the plan that was mooted against Azorius Control, for example, or the 4-color decks, where it is so easy for those decks to just go over the top of that card. Whereas if the entire game plan is about trading resources and really downsizing the game, that's where Bitter Blossom really tends to excel. So worth keeping that one in mind for the future. Looking at the rest of this top 8, as you mentioned, we had this undefeated run from Z Yo-Yo in first. I'm not going to miscredit them any further. And then The rest of this top 8, we have 2 different graveyard decks, a copy of Dredge and a copy of Oops All Spells. And the topic of graveyard hate is one that we'll come back to over the course of the previews in this episode. But worth noting that for the time being, in Modern, you need to show up with some graveyard hate, and enough of it that you can have it early and often.
Yeah, I do want to shout out Zayur. Oh gosh, you want to say this for me? Zayuryo?
I think it's phonetic, just Zayuryo.
Zayuryo, for having the absolute surprise out of the Azoria sideboard of a Blood Moon and 3 Ragavans. And also big props to promptly winning the challenge, right-click, opening all their chests, and posting the picture to Twitter of what appears to be about 50 tickets worth of equity.
I was hoping this was going to end in just opening a 4th Ragavan that they can put in their sideboard for the following week.
No, it's just full committal to just like, this is what has occurred. And everyone I have showed this to's response was immediately, ooh, they got all the bad chests out of the way. I'm going to go open all of mine. Just a real inspiration to the community.
Yeah, not sure if that's quite how math works exactly, but more on that front as we hear it, I suppose. Looking down beneath this top 8, we have the Oswald deck in 9th place, just missing out here. Always fun to see that. And that's a deck which I have a little more interest in coming back to as a result of some of these preview cards here. And then for the most part, it's kind of more of the same. A lot of 4-color Blink decks looking down here, some Shadow decks, including Soulstrong, towards the wrong end of the top 32 this time on the 4-color Shadow deck. We've got some Sacred Foundries in there, and then that opens up this Prismatic Ending Kaya's Gala Splash, which we've mentioned on here a bit before.
Yeah, I do want to shout out 10th place also being a different artifact deck. In this case, Affinity with a full 12 artifact lands between Treasure Vault, Citadel, and the Dimir Bridge, with just like 8 Mirror Enforcers, some real like Pauper and Modern stuff. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Hey, could you name the Dimir Bridge off the top of your head?
I had to look at the card name on the Wizard's site and then hover over it to see whether it was blue-black or blue-white. So no, not in the slightest.
Yeah, I guess this goes the other way too, is if I gave you the name of a bridge, could you tell me its color combination?
I would be probably better than 1 out of 10, but not by much.
I think that route or that direction is a little bit easier because the names are very like A plus B in one sense, and so sometimes you can kind of piece it together that way. But yeah, the other way around is a true hard mode here.
Well, you say this, but I've played this game with other cycles. I think specifically the Ona cycle from Saviors of Kamigawa, and I watched Jarvis get 5 out of 5 wrong, which is impressive because at the end you think you'd have process of elimination. No, just 5 out of 5.
All right, hit me.
Okay. So oh gosh, I have to look these up. There's Kiriona.
Kiriona, I want to say, is the red one.
That is incorrect.
Okay, well, already off to a terrible start here.
I think that Kiriona is the blue one. There's Kiriona. There's, oh my gosh, I'm trying to actually remember these. There's Nico Ona.
I'm going to say Nico Ona is the white one because I remember that being the only vaguely playable one in the entire cycle.
Correct. There's Haru Ona.
Well, I had a different one penciled in as the green one, but this is sounding vaguely green, but that might just be me confusing it with Hanakami. So I'm going to say black?
That is incorrect. It was the green one.
Oh, God.
Okay, and then we have Yuki Ona.
Okay, I'm going to say that's the black one now.
No, that's the red one. And Kimuri Ona.
Okay, well, process of elimination, I guess. That has to be the black one. Get that one on the house.
We got 2 out of 5. That's not bad. But the upcoming Kamigawa previews the names are slightly easier to parse. Maybe not the text boxes, but we will be jumping right into that after a short break here.
If you want to buy Magic the Gathering cards, you know we have you covered, but if you want to sell them, that's never been easier too. With a 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell anywhere else. Go to starcitygames.com/sell and pick one of 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. You can use our buy list, you can ship your cards to us, you can come to us in person in Roanoke, Virginia, and if you have an entire inventory that you want to offload, we can come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell for more information. Okay, we are back to expunge the shameful memories of old Kamigawa out of my mind and get on to the new and exciting upcoming Kamigawa set. And I don't know how much nostalgia value the Plane of Kamigawa holds for you. One reason that I'm so ashamed of that debacle just now is that Saviors of Kamigawa was my first preview season as a young Magic player, and the fact that I stuck around through that meant I was just hooked in for life, obviously. But also, coming off of one of the first Magic cards I owned for myself being Umazawa's just may have set the bar a little high, and then seeing the Saviors of Kamigawa set trickle down really just put the bar through the floor. And so I think we've reached a happy medium with what we're looking at right here.
Yeah, so I mean, my history with Kamigawa is that it was the first block where I was like seriously competitively drafting against people. So I had like a deep appreciation for all the really weird stuff. And we did just talk about Saviors of Kamigawa, and like I like know all the commons and like the one person who will be out here defending the hand size mechanic. So I am interested to see this. The cards that have been revealed it feels very almost in the vein of like Kaldheim and Strixhaven, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You just, you got to read a little more properly. And I think they have fixed some of the issues with Kaldheim where like all the cards that do approximately the same thing actually do it the same way.
Yeah, you don't have any weird mismatches where this one card in our 10 card cycle can only be activated as an instant or as a sorcery rather, and then some of them are instant speed, and then there's a lot of just disjointed contradictions, even in the parts of the set that look like they should operate the same way. And I think there is a more cohesive feel to this set this time. There is a lot going on, though. I did not expect coming in for this to be maybe the closest thing to an artifact set or an artifact block that we've had since, I guess, Kaladesh now. And on top of that, you have a lot of the callbacks to old school Kamigawa while also trying to keep things new, and a bunch of interesting mechanics like reconfigure, the modified, I don't know if it's a keyword or description or what it is, but that's now a thing which maybe will remain a part of the game going forward. A lot to digest, and I do wonder with a lot of these recent sets, I think Kaldheim certainly suffered from this. If it's the kind of thing which, if it was in a 3-set block, like the original Kamigawa, and we definitely saw this with Saviors, they kind of ran out of ideas towards the end. But then in a one-set block, which I guess is just a set, it's so hard to fit in all of this stuff and give it all room to breathe. So I wonder if this were like an Innistrad kind of revisit of 2 sets back to back, if this would feel more clean in that way. But I'm excited to get however much of this we get for the time being.
Yeah, I'll just say that if one of the inspirations is like Cyberpunk, anyone who has ever read Neuromancer and then like reads this set will maybe immediately make the connection I did of just like, oh, it's just a lot of pretty words and you're not entirely sure what's going on any given page, but you'll piece it together later.
And in the interest of trying to piece together what's going on here, let's dive into some of these cards. Where do we want to start? There have been a few cycles we've had either glimpses of so far or the full cycles in some cases. And I think those maybe are a good kind of place to lead in here. So let's get into, let's not bury the lead. Let's get into both a callback to the original Kamigawa and maybe one of the most exciting features of this new Kamigawa visit.
Yeah, so these are the legendary land cycle that has channel. Glad to see channel back. And these all have a channel of some colorless and a mana of their color to do something, and the ability costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control, and they're just untapped legendary lands that make whatever color they are. And I believe we have officially seen 3 of these now?
Yeah, we have official spoilers for 3 out of the 5, and then the other 2, actually, I think were the first 2 spoiled, but those remain unofficial at this point. So we'll just keep ourselves to the 3 that we officially know about. And for the people who are not deep in the Saviors of Kamigawa lore, Channel is effectively cycling, but you don't draw a card. It just has some kind of spell-like effect attached to it. So you pay the cost, you discard the card, you get the thing. And this is at instant speed, and it's uncounterable. It's not a spell, it's just an activated ability, which gives it a new layer of protection against a lot of different forms of interaction. And by itself, you don't need the effect to be that good or to be that efficient for that to be a nice rider on top by itself.
Yeah, we can compare these to the original Champions of Kamigawa legendary lands, where like you actually had to have the second copy of the land on the battlefield. Like if you drew your second Shizo, it was never doing anything. Whereas in this case, if you draw to Seju Who Endures, you can use both of them in basically any way except for playing 2 lands. So you have a lot more flexibility. And I expect, you only ever see people playing with 1 Shinka these days. You will probably see multiple copies of the good ones of these.
Yeah, you do actually see people playing with the first copy of Shinka and so on these days. It's kind of funny that just printing Ragavan by itself has almost given this cycle a new lease on life. And I guess like Lurrus is part of that equation too. But yeah, you see Shinka and Shizo helping Ragavan attack in combat, or Igandro Castle protecting Lurrus from a lightning bolt or something. That's actually a reasonably common part of current Modern, which is kind of fun to see. But back in the day, drawing the first copy of these legendary lands had a pretty big risk attached to it too, where the new legendary rule at the time, the one that came in with Champions of Kamigawa for good reason, was that if I control a copy of a legend and you play a copy of the same legend, they immediately self-destruct, if you like. Both of them are put into the graveyard as a state-based effect. And so with the creatures that were legends, or these expensive legendary permanents, that was kind of an interesting dynamic a lot of the time. What happened with the legendary lands, though, is I keep my 2-land hand, I play my Shizo, you happen to draw the 1 Shizo that's in your deck, and now I just can't play spells anymore. And so there was this potential for incredibly swingy turns where, it just so happened that the stars aligned and both of you drew the right or the wrong, I guess, legendary land at the same time.
Yeah, this way is certainly better. I will say that. Though I guess we should start talking about these cards because they are very powerful and they are going to show up. And when you and your opponent draw them, it's going to matter in a different way.
Yeah, so let's start with the maybe the most impactful card from this set and the topic of my article from last week. And that's for Seju Who Endures. So this is the green land in the cycle. Legendary land, untapped, taps for green, and that pattern will be repeated through the rest of them. And then its channel ability is 1 and a green, destroy, and I'll make sure I get the full range of possible targets here. You destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land that an opponent controls, and then they may search their library for a land with a basic land type and put it onto the battlefield. And so that clause allows for shock lands, triomes in these larger formats, as well as basic lands. And so you're very rarely going to get to actually sinkhole or strip mine someone with this, with some important exceptions we'll get to in just a second here, because those are some pretty exciting uses for the card. But this is just a land which, if you draw future copies of this, or just the first copy sometimes, this is a flexible, instant speed, uncounterable removal spell. And that by itself should get your ears perking up.
Yeah, it almost feels like the kind of card where, because it exists, you will see land counts increase by like 1.5 across a lot of decks. Because I have been talked down on like the initial impact of this, because it is still Assassin's Trophy, which is still not the best at all times, but just like, it's so low cost to have such a flexible removal spell in your deck that it's just really something else. The non-basic land part is going to come up probably the most of any of these, just like clean-shotting Ursa Saga or a castle against the control decks, or just like the various blink decks only having 1 of each triome could come up and you could get someone that way. Though maybe that's a little sketchier. I think that it is... I mean, again, there's also like artifacts and enchantments in Modern. It clears a lot of stuff at relatively low cost. And then there's just I think specifically the thing that might put it over the top is the interaction with Wrenn and 6, where you do actually approach that Ghost Quarter setup with Wrenn and 6, where you could clear out all their lands from their deck, except for in this case, it costs you like mana every turn, but you're not obligated into it. You don't have to like do all sorts of weird stuff with land drops. You're not necessarily stunting your future mana growth. It's significantly better and significantly lower cost.
Yeah, this is a card whose utility really scales with the size of a format. So you look at Standard, for example, and okay, I guess you get to tank a Seeker's Chariot some amount of the time, or most of the decks will have their on-color creature land and you get to blow that up. Fine, whatever. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have Mishra's Workshop, Bazaar of Baghdad, literally every card in a Mishra's Workshop deck, Oath of Druids, Underworld Breach, what have you. And Modern is squarely in the middle of that, but there are so many useful targets here in basically every high-level deck, except for the family of like Ragavan Channeler decks, that I think this is going to see pretty substantial play across the board. So in a context where we've mentioned Oops All Spells and Goblin Charbelcher, both as premier strategies in the format, really the most common combo decks at this point, this card is just a straight up sinkhole with upside against both of them, because when your entire mana base consists of the DFCs, by definition, you can't. I guess if you're a madman, you can work the one basic in there, and we've seen that in some sideboards back in the day. And honestly, maybe if Boseiju becomes common enough, you will have to do that just as a failsafe. But the fact that in Game 1 scenarios, at least, this can just blow up the Shadow Skull smashing as a land, or the Turn Timber Symbiosis as a land on their side with no return. That is the kind of thing which can really flip a bad matchup into one where you actually have decent odds a lot of the time. And then also, both of these decks, both Charbelcher itself, of course, and Oops All Spells, have Goblin Charbelcher in them, which if they have to pass a turn and hope to untap with that, this is the perfect countermeasure there. And then also stuff like Blood Moon, or in the Oops deck, you need your Paint-Out Prisms or your Talismans to get set up. And so this is just excellent coverage there across the board.
Yeah, it's really something else. And I think that we understated the fact that this costs 1 less if you control a legend here, because when you drop this down to 1 mana, especially if you have a Ragavan against these decks, it's just like a whole different ballgame in terms of what you're doing on any given turn. Like, if you Stone Rain someone and develop your board on a given turn, even for a combo deck, it's going to get really hard to race you. This card is really bad news for those decks unless you go Maniac mode and add the basic to your deck.
Yeah, and likewise against Tron, which has been popping in and out of the format as of late, this isn't better than a lot of the really explicit anti-Tron options that we've had added to the format recently. So when you play Tron in a tournament, you understand that any of your opponents could, in theory, show up with Break the Ice was one example from MH2, Cleansing Wildfire, Obsidian Charmor, again, just really doubling down on that angle. But for the most part, your opponents won't do that because no one's playing Tron, and so why would you devote all of those sideboard slots to these relatively narrow cards? The scary thing about Boseiju isn't that it's more powerful than any of those, it's that it is so versatile that you can justify putting this in your main deck, putting additional copies in your sideboard, and when they do, your Tron deck becomes splash damage almost by accident there.
Yeah, I do think that there's some room to wiggle, because I just remember playing Tron, like specifically the mono green Tron against the Field of Rune decks right when that card came out. I think that was a Pro Tour that this lined up with that I played Tron at. And I think that if you build your deck with like 5 or 6 Force in it and start like, it depends on how this card lines up with companion reveals. But if you know your opponent is on a Boseiju deck, you may be able to adjust your mulligan strategies to not like try to shove all in on Tron and assume a 4-card hand with Tron is going to defeat them. But it is going to require some adjustment. And I don't think it's as painful as it is for the DFC combo decks, but you're going to have to figure out something. And the answer may just be like, don't play Tron into Boseiju.
On the other hand, one consolation there is that Boseiju is really good in Tron, where you have an answer now to stuff like Alpine Moon or Blood Moon are the 2 big ones nowadays, but also just this incredibly flexible answer to like the Hammer deck, for example, which is one of your terrible matchups traditionally, or you still have those games sometimes where your handful of Ancient Stirrings and Chromatic Spheres gets locked out of a Chalice of the Void, and Boseiju now gives you an answer to all of those that you put in your deck at very low cost, because it's still just an untapped green source that casts your Stirrings, casts your Scrying, and then when you cast that Scrying, or with Expedition Map, you now have eight or more ways to just find that answer cleanly in your main deck. And so a card like Alpine Moon or Blood Moon, yeah, in theory, with Alpine Moon, for example, you could find your Blast Zone and then take the turn off to crack your Blast Zone and then go from there. That's a lot of hoops to jump through. This is much simpler, much easier, and as you say, that tactic doesn't even work against stuff like Blood Moon, and so this one does, and this one gives you great coverage there. I imagine there's going to be some blowouts in the mirror where a player who is on course to have the perfect turn 3 Tron start just loses to the copy of Boseiju that gets drawn or gets tutored for. And so yeah, against the other big mana decks, this is a really nice pickup too, and just in general, just the first copy adds this layer of flexibility to your Tron deck that gives it this whole new counterplay against hate there.
Yeah, it is sort of interesting how this card, you mentioned some of the things that it like weirdly lines up with because it's a land from your hand. It does not line up well against Pithing Needle, but it would line up well against like, I'm thinking, I don't know if there's like a ton of, I'm trying to think of what the like effective Thalia effect would be in the format. I know the Teferi like Time Raveler lineup has been discussed where you can use this on their end step even if they control a Teferi because it's not a spell. Very weird that this is an instant that can destroy lands, but that's a whole different thing.
Mm-hmm. And moving down the line here, big day for Primeval Titan fans, of course. The applications there are fairly straightforward, where your Primeval Titan can now, you have Amulet in play, you find this and a bounce out at instant speed, and now you just have this interactive spell that you got to tutor up without going through some convoluted Talaria West line that you often don't have the mana or the time for. Again, excellent in those mirrors or against other big mana decks there. And then also, this is a tutable way to answer something like a Blood Moon, where against Is It Murktide, for example, that was such a difficult matchup, in part because you had to hedge against Blood Moon, but you couldn't really hedge exclusively against Blood Moon because their deck, as it stands normally, is very good against you, and drawing a Force of Vigor against their normal draw is kind of a disaster. And so now you have this thing which, you can fetch with Titan, you can fetch with Expedition Map, Talaria West, and so on, and you just have answers to that now without even trying. And so a fantastic pickup for Amulet. On the other hand, I don't even know how good this printing is for the deck on balance, because a lot of your opponents now will have access to Seju, and that hits all of the setup pieces for the deck. It hits Amulet, it hits Dryad, hits Ursa Saga, hits your balance lands crucially too, which, the deck didn't keel over and die the moment that Assassin's Trophy or Cleansing Wildfire got printed, but as part of a larger recipe to beat the deck, it's pretty formidable there too.
Can I make the argument that this is a push in the direction of a Valakut, like a true like Mountains and Valakut Primeval Titan deck over
sure.
Amulet? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that where this card is going to shine against Amulet is not in the games where the Titan actually resolves. It's just going to mess with people getting to that point, or like leaning on their Dryad of the Elysian Grove to set up Valakut. If you're just like a Valakut deck that's just like, I'm going to scape shift you and we'll deal with this later, or I'm just going to cast Titan. Like, if you're just like finding two Valakuts with a Titan, Boseiju is not going to save you. So unless like, there's some like kill one, Ren and 6 it back, kill the other, kill the Titan. But that's like a lot of setup, I think, to ask for. So I think we may see a slight diversification of the Titan decks moving forward.
Yeah, it makes it harder to manually trigger your Valakut because those decks already wanted to minimize on strict green sources. And this is an additional green source that, it's on a mountain, and every Boseiju you have in play, which I guess is just the one, doesn't help you count towards Valakut. But for the sake of either Dryad on one end or Scapeshift on the other, then this is this lets you kind of artificially cheat the cap on your land count while working in answers to some of the interaction that can get in your way towards progressing either of those plans. So like old school classic Scapeshift with some of these new toys might actually be worth another look here.
Yeah, and this is, you talk about cheating land counts. I want to point out that like Arboreal Grazer is one of the best cards in the Amulet Titan deck that the other Valakut, like the actual Valakut decks, don't get to play a lot of, because there's an issue. Like the Amulet deck plays like 30 lands or whatever, but it's like secretly playing more because of the bounce lands. And because of Boseiju, you can sort of cheat your way up to approximately the same kind of land counts, which really is what you need to make Grazer so good. So I think that might be another like layer of this whole puzzle to solve.
And I think those layers compound on each other too, because Ren and 6 really gains a lot with this entire cycle, but with Boseiju in particular, and Ren and 6 and Arboreal Grazer go hand in hand too, where Ren with a fetch land allows you to have these additional land drops that let you throw away cards on something like Arboreal Grazer, but then also having these cards in the mix means Ren and 6 isn't just picking up a fetch land every turn, it can also pick up a premium interaction in the case of Boseiju, or with the next member of the cycle that we'll get onto, it can turn itself into this roundabout way to create a threat at the same time. So Ren and 6 was already actually under the radar in terms of how obnoxious it is to play against sometimes. And when we aired our grievances last time, I think Ren and 6 maybe deserved its own segment there in terms of its impact on the format and its play patterns and so on. And you should expect to see even more of that card now. that one really is not going anywhere.
Yeah, I'm more okay with Ren and 6, but I think maybe it's just sort of like a learned acceptance of what it does to the format, and maybe the fact that it's sort of the good guy in the fight against all the red 1-drops in a weird way.
Yeah, I think it's worth unpacking which kinds of Ren and 6 decks can make good use of this card, because if you take your standard 80 card 4-color Yorion deck, where you have this pretty strict color requirements, which are made possible by fetch lands and triomes and shock lands, a card that only taps 1 color of mana, unless it is the basic forest for you to fetch off those relevant fetch lands there, makes it harder to really cast your spells. And especially having just a green source in a deck that has Expressive Iteration, Counterspell, Solitude, and so on and so forth, the base rate on this card just as a land is not that high, and so you can't pack these into your mana base and keep the same land count while inflating your density of interaction the way that you might be able to with, let's say, a strictly red-green deck, or like a Teamer deck that has your one triome to tie the room together, and then you can kind of make it up as you go along from there. With 4-color, you really need to stay focused in that sense. I know Andrew Ellenbogen has been boasting to all of the big mana enthusiasts that he can find that, with his Ren and 6s and Besejus, then he's not scared of any of them anymore. But I don't think that he can do that by just keeping the same land count. I think it's going to be, I'm going to chip away at my Icefang Corrals or whatever I think the next worst card is in my spell slots to make room for more copies of these.
Yeah, and that has real ramifications against the fair decks of the format. You just said Coatl, and that is, if you have Bosejus instead of Coatls, that is going to extremely reduce your matchup against Grixis Shadow. Just like a card that doesn't do anything for a card that does something. Even though there's like this technical idea that they only have 2 basics, like you're not going to run them out in time. Their deck is just way too efficient for you to like Boseju plus Ren, Boseju again in the games that you weren't already going to win. And like, again, there's a reason that Icefang Coatl made its way into the deck.
Yeah, and a useful reminder there, because I forgot about this as I was writing my article on the subject, is it is lands with a basic land type. And so it's not just about getting them to run out their island and their swamp or whatever. It's I need to work through their watery graves and their blood crypts and their one steam vents and so on before I'm actually turning this into a card with no downside there. And so, yeah, against 4-color, yeah, sometimes you can blow up specifically this triome, but then they can usually fetch the shock land that covers 2 of those 3 colors and find their way out of that.
Right. So maybe we're saying that Leonin Arbiter is, due for a comeback.
Oh, God.
No, don't do it.
Well, kind of in that vein, actually. One Ren and 6 Boseju deck that I've seen people excited about is the liquid metal coating land destruction deck from a while back, where you have your 3 coatings in the main deck, 1 in the sideboard, to pair with your Khans, which is the chocolate for liquid metal coatings peanut butter. But then also, once you're doing the liquid metal coating stuff, in conjunction with the Besejus, which pad the density of naturalizers that you have in your deck, well, yeah, now you can just turn their Death Shadow into a artifact and blow it up, or turn whatever the hell you like into an artifact and blow it up. And that angle of the deck becomes even more reliable now.
Yeah, I hate all of this. I just hate all of this.
Going back to some more wholesome applications here, as you said, is a very nice failsafe against Ursa Saga, but then also, as a second order consequence, very nice against all of the stuff that these Ursa Saga decks are trying to do. So against Hammer, for example, yeah, this is an instant speed answer to Sigala's Aid or Colossus Hammer, or sometimes the creature that they're putting the thing on if it's an artifact creature. So it increases the ways that you have as just a mopey random green deck to actually interact with them and keep them honest. And so maybe that's going to prompt a move in the Hammer decks to the builds that can play a stronger, grindier game and don't have to be as all in on just, sticking 2 hammers on an Ornithopter and going from there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really hard to say that I would like my Hammer deck to get grindier without really compromising the combo potential. Like, there's a lot of weird interlocking pieces involved in terms of like reliability and artifact count for Metalcraft that I don't know exactly how much you can adjust. And like, even the ways you adjust are right into things like Nettlecyst that are kind of dicey.
The other home that stood out for me is the Cascade decks, and Rhinos in particular, where that deck has always had an issue with balancing its land count properly, where you need to get to 3 mana every game in order to do anything useful. On the other hand, you don't have that much in the way of flood protection, and so you can't just go up to 26, 27 lands and call it a day, really. And so the first Seju, I don't know if you can afford to play many more than that, but at least the first copy goes a long way in terms of padding your land count while also being the perfect answer to something like Chalice of the Void. At instant speed, where you do this on their end step, they can't protect against that in advance by playing out another Chalice because the first one would just counter that on the way down. And so you get to guarantee this window where you can resolve your Cascade spell or just unlock the rest of your hand there. And all of these other applications that we have mentioned so far get grafted on there too.
Yeah, that does sound really enticing. I kind of want to shout out potentially, depending on what else is going on, it also is like an interesting lineup for if we go back to like true elementals. If that deck ever runs into Torpor Orb issues, like that's like a really nice free way that like doesn't really interact poorly with anything else and like is totally fine to flip off Risen Reef. So kind of another minor case, but same kind of case of the card busting up various artifact hate cards.
And I think you'll see that basically everywhere that you can. So Yorkmoth, for example, especially now with this reduced focus on Grass Messenger, the first copy of Seju in a deck that used to have the first copy of Pendelhaven, lest we forget, as a way to blow up a Pithing Needle or a Gratiger's Cage or a Torpor Orb that's causing you grief. Those effects are not nearly as reliable as they used to be, especially when, if it is something like Cage, which shuts down not just the main combo applications, but also the cards that would get the cards that are meant to blow that card up to unlock the rest of your cards. Having more cards that are just good to draw that also do that for you is really nice insurance there. Yeah,
so we spent a lot of time on both Seju. There are 2 more lands in this cycle to talk about. Is there a lot to talk about with these, or is it still a little dicey with those?
I guess just as a closing thought on Seju, I think the first copy is effectively free in a lot of places. There is some tension sometimes where nowadays decks have so many good utility lands they can choose between, and some of those place further demands on you. So in the Amulet deck, for example, this is where it comes up a lot, where you need a certain amount of untapped green sources, but those could be any number of things. They could be this, it could be Lair of the Hydra, Turntable Symbiosis, what have you. But then also there's this pressure to play as many forests as you can for your Castle Garen bricks. You want some Cavern of Souls as well. So it's really hard to find the perfect ratio there. The first copy is guaranteed, absolutely bulletproof. But then I don't know if you can just slam 4 of these in your Amulet deck and call it a day. I think there are sometimes some tough choices that come up. In general, though, I would expect the first copy to be omnipresent if your mana base wants green mana at all. And then maybe you play some additional copies in the sideboard if you like, or maybe they sink their way into the main deck if the rest of your deck allows for that.
Yep, I agree with absolutely all of that. It is free, but a measured kind of free.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Sokenzan then. So this is the red one. Its official title, Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance. Its channel ability is 3 in a red, discard Sokenzan. You create 2 1/1 colorless spirit tokens, and they gain haste until end of turn. And then, as always, this costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control. And so there are 2 places my mind immediately jumped with this card. The first is the various slightly bigger mono red decks we've seen running around. So like the M. Hayashi red decks, for example, I'm sure we'll love to have at least one, but would not surprise me if specifically M. Hayashi ends up running more copies of this card. And then the other one was the Indomitable Creativity decks, where there's such a natural curve here of channel this, untap, creativity for 2. The issue there is, as it currently stands, most of those decks are built around Dwarven Mine, and this is many things, and it is close to free in many respects, but it's not a mountain. And so that's kind of stymieing the problem that it's meant to address in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and those decks, because of mine, are already in a position where they can't afford more mono red sources. It's kind of dicey to have it's the classic case of my mono red deck wants red green on 2, Azorius on 3 because of Teferi and Ren, and you're already stretched pretty thin with just the mines and trying to fetch all these mountains. I do expect it to show up in the M Hayashi decks and probably also the like various Gruul decks. And this is again, this one does cost 4, so the cost reduction on Ragavan being in play is more relevant. It is a push for the Gruul decks towards. I guess that's not entirely true. Klothys is kind of weird with this. I was like, oh yeah, Klothys, it's a creature, but it's not quite. So
it is legendary creature, and I keep thinking that Wrenn and 6 reduces these costs automatically by itself, which luckily it does not. But if your deck already is a base red-green Wrenn and 6 Boseiju deck, then the first copy of this on the house sounds pretty sweet.
Okay, so let me talk to you about Bard class, or I think we're about done with that one.
Well, I'm not. Speak for yourself here, though.
Okay. Maybe a different episode we can get around to the Bard class deck with all of these. But yeah, I think that Sokenzen is going to be a little lighter in application, but it does have like a very specific case, and it is relatively powerful in terms of like absolutely being free. So good job. And probably in smaller formats will be much more impressive.
Yeah, I think this is maybe where the cycle ought to be aiming at, and Boseiju is pretty varied in terms of these smaller formats, whereas, you play one because why not, versus the larger Eternal formats where it is potentially a game changer in all of them. Soken-san is... This one is not reinventing the wheel here. It's not overhauling every format by itself. It's just, hey, it's a solid role player, and in 5 years' time, in, I don't know, Historic, if Arena still exists, or Legacy or whatever, you're going to see the first copy of this still a lot of the time. Let's get on to the final member of the cycle that we do know about at this stage, and that is the blue one, Otawara City Above Clouds, not Ottawa, I should point out. This is... legendary land, taps for blue, channel is 3 in a blue, discard Otawara, return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand, and this costs 1 less, of course, for each legendary creature you control. And so this also is pretty obnoxious with Wrenn and 6, but then you start getting into some weird mana-based considerations there. In general, though, if you have, let's say, a blue control deck of some description, let's say blue-white, blue-red, and so on, this is a land that satisfies the most demanding mana requirements of can this cast Counterspell, can this cast Archmage's Charm, and then also pairs pretty well with those cards in any kind of longer game.
Yeah, I'm actually, you had mentioned the applications of Boseiju and Cascade decks. I'm more interested in this card there because it specifically answers the Planeswalker card type and Teferi that the other ones don't. And it also answers Teferi in a significantly more powerful way than a lot of the other stuff that you could be using because it's uncounterable. And when, like, one of the bottlenecks with that deck when playing against Teferi is that you're actually relatively good at fighting over resolving your Cascade spells because of all your Force Negations and Mystical Disputes. This is like why when the deck broke out, it was such a big deal because you were like Violent Outbursting on your control opponent's upkeep and double countering their counterspell and winning the game. But when they have Teferi, you can't fight back in that fashion, and you don't really have a recourse for your Brazen Bar or whatever other, bounce spell getting countered. Having an uncounterable bounce spell that's just like completely free to put in your deck is a really huge deal when fighting against that card.
Yeah, and there is some amount of crossover here between what this answers, if only temporarily, and what Boseiju answers permanently when you look at stuff like the Hammer deck, for example. If they're going for their one big finish, then sometimes, you're bouncing it back to the hand versus answering it altogether, but that might be the one thing you need in order to pivot the game into a winnable position from that point. Or in any kind of longer control mirror, this card potentially is a mirror breaker where sometimes all you want to do in the control mirror is just play as many lands as possible. This does a job there. And then sometimes what you need to do is contest the Teferi that's on their side, or the even bigger Teferi that's on their side, or Wrenn and 6 in these 4-color mirrors. This is... I don't know how you would compare this to Boseiju, or if that's even a useful comparison to make, but I think that the blue decks that end up playing, I imagine exactly one copy of this card will really be happy to see it a lot of the time. Yeah,
and let me just double check I didn't miss a word in here on this card, but I believe there's actually something to keep in mind. Yep, it can target your own permanents. So in these long control mirrors, there actually are games where it comes down to everything trading. I would just keep that in mind, that you can use this to sort of like convert it into a threat against an opposing removal spell, which is probably not the most likely use case, but good to know about when things go long.
Yeah, there could even be some weird thing of like, I have 4 mana, I evoke Solitude, I pick it back up, and then I untap, make my 5th land drop, and then just hardcast Solitude, something like that.
Yeah, or you could just like pick up your Solitude and recast it and turn this into a permanent removal spell.
Yeah, so very difficult not to find applications for this card when you go looking for them. Doesn't do it super efficiently unless you can reduce the cost somehow. And that's a little harder here than it is for, certainly for any of the Ragavan decks, although maybe there's some crossover there. I don't think you can afford this land in, like Is a Murktide would be the classic example of, you just have so few lands that all of them need to be very on plan in terms of what they do for your mana base. And I don't think a non-fetchable island essentially is what you want there. But for a deck that maybe can afford to go a little bigger, then you could access that cost reduction there. Or I was thinking in some of these artifact-heavy decks, like with Ursa, for instance, that reduces the cost. And then this is a pretty nice way to immediately use a bunch of that Ursa mana. And one of those applications might be picking up your own Ursa to protect it from removal as well.
Yeah, and those do tend to be Yorion decks as well, another great card to cycle through there. And also, because they are Yorion decks that are relatively not color committal, you actually have a lot of space for these lands, so that might be a really good spot.
Yeah. Now, of course, Ari, there is one deck that I know you're a fan of, which can search up lands on demand and also has a lot of blue mana to play with. Is this a blue Tron moment to make its return?
Oh, I thought you were going to refer to Merfolk and just jokingly talk about searching up lands, but I do think this actually is a reasonably large player for Blue Tron in terms of what it offers. I actually think that it's also a pretty big player for Merfolk. Just like, again, that deck's big issue is the overlap of like needing to play a double blue spell on turn 2 in a lot of spots, but then also needing to get value out of its lands. And this is why the like more recent surge of Merfolk over those couple weeks, a few months ago, those decks were really focused on playing a bunch of Glasspool Mimics. This card kind of extends that exact category. So I would actually look to it in both Blutron and Merfolk to shout out the lower representation decks in the format.
A very good euphemism there. And of course, the classic Boyle Merfolk deck now gets to use this and Borrow and Minamo all in concert together to protect its mana base from its own very hateful cards there.
Yeah, probably makes it bad against the Blood Moon Merfolk deck, though. So you got to balance the mirror match there.
Well, if the format ever circles around to the place where, when Mystic Sanctuary was in its heyday and Tiamu, I believe their name was playing the blue-red deck with no islands just so they could sideboard Boyle, then I guess this is one more piece of that puzzle too.
That was horrible. Let's never talk about Mystic Sanctuary.
Yeah, let's talk about something else here. So that is the first cycle that we know about, but there are some more cycles here which we've seen some members of. Let's get on to Invoke Calamity, and this might be one of those cards which looks very eye-catching and has potentially broken applications, but never ends up going anywhere in this format at the very least. So this entire cycle, very unfortunately named given the precedent, but they are all quad mana of their color. So in this case, is 1 and quadruple red. So Invoke Calamity is an instant, and it lets you cast up to 2 instant and or sorcery spells with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard and or hand without paying their mana costs. If those spells would be put into your graveyard, exile them instead, and then the usual safety valve of you have to exile Invoke Calamity. And so there are some like Sins of the Past in Flames style vibes going on here, but I'm not sure what the obvious thing you're meant to do with this is.
Yeah, I think you make a good point in your notes here that it works with the like 0 cost suspend spells, but like looping Wheel of Fate, like the fact that Invoke Calamity can cast another copy of Invoke Calamity that has ended up in your graveyard is kind of interesting to me. Even though it exiles itself, I think that is like probably one of the more powerful things to do is figure out how to like chain off a couple spells. I don't really know exactly the right way to do that, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, so Invoke Calamity, it's a 5-cost card that lets you cast up to 6 total mana value in cards. And so if one of those cards is another Invoke Calamity, you keep the chain going, and then you can fold a 1-drop in there for free, or you can cast just a card literally for free if it's one of these suspend cards. The issue there, though, is it doesn't really work well with the suspend cards that have been proven to be good. So I don't know if you're ever going to target a Crashing Footfalls with this, for example, or certainly not Living End, or I don't know what the Glimpse of Tomorrow deck would look like that could play this card, but I dread to think about it. I have my eyes on specifically Profane Tutor, because being able to tutor for this and then Calamity back the tutor and something else, if that something else is a ritual, which maybe this is why Seething Song is not unbanned in Modern yet, because it would pair phenomenally well with this card, but there is stuff like Channel the Suns if you want to go that deep, or even just stuff like Desperate Ritual, Poetic Ritual, the usual ones there. You can set up some kind of chain, but I don't know what that's meant to culminate in, or how you get up to 5 mana in the first place in any reasonable time frame. In terms of specific things you can do with this, maybe there's some kind of Storm deck or Storm pile for a card like Gifts Ungiven, where you could return gifts and a Manamorphose or a ritual, something like that. Or the exact combination that caught my eye was First Day of Class and Envy the Warrens. So First Day of Class is a 2-mana card from Strixhaven, where any creature that enters the battlefield under your control for the rest of the turn has a +1/+1 counter and gains haste, and then you get to learn as well. And then Envy the Warrens you'll be familiar with. And so if you have a high enough storm count coming in, and worth noting that when you have a storm spell and something else with this, the storm spell doesn't see the other spell in terms of its storm count, unless I'm misinterpreting that. And so you do need to get to kind of N-1 just before this. But if you start off the chain with enough spells, then that's a nice clean way to get lethal on the spot. There's also Ad Nauseam and Angel's Grace, where, okay, you resolve your Invoke Calamity, you turn over your whole deck, but then what? Because we don't have Simian Spirit Guide anymore. We don't have many ways to immediately convert that into something useful, and so that requires even more setup, and at that point you're already jumping through so many hoops that it doesn't seem worth it at all.
Yeah, that's a lot, because they already have to be in your graveyard, and I don't know, that is a lot to ask. And then also red, black, what the Ad Nauseam deck has some weird mana already, so yeah, it is interesting to think about, and unless someone just like shares that they have an instant win 2-card combo that this sets up, I'm skeptical, but it is worth like filing away in the list of other weird expensive red sorceries that exist in Modern.
Yeah, there are definitely things you can do if you add pieces onto this, or if you get to copy this card, or you chain one of these into the next one. But in terms of just resolving one copy for 5 mana and that's all you need, I don't think that exists. But if you can find it, then by all means do let us know. Yeah.
Let's jump over to a slightly more efficient in some way sorcery or instant. This is March of Otherworldly Light. This is X and white for an instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you can exile any number of white spells from your hand to reduce its cost by 2 for each card you exile, and it has exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. So I was not very interested in this, but you pointed out something that I had missed, which is that this can target an enchantment named Ursa Saga.
Yeah, and that's going to be, if anything pushes it over the top, it's going to be that specific interaction where we've seen people sideboard like Wear Tear in their control decks, or any deck where the mana supports it, and one of the main intentions there is to just blow up their Ursa Saga on turn 1, turn 2 as early as possible. So this does that, and then it's not limited to that either. It's just a very flexible removal spell, and other than exactly Ursa Saga, you're never really getting a good deal in terms of mana. So Prismatic Ending, for example, is basically trading at parity all the time. So you're getting a 1-drop, you're spending 1 mana. You're getting a 2-drop for 2 mana, and so on up the curve. With this card, you're either throwing away a card in order to get that efficiency, or you're paying an additional mana. So you pay 1 and a white to kill a 1-drop, and so on. And that specific difference of 1 mana versus 2 mana to kill a Ragavan or a Dragon's Rage Channeler, that is a big deal. And so I've seen some chatter of, does this card replace or supplant Prismatic Ending? No, it doesn't. I think this is an addition to that roster, but you're going to load up on Prismatic Endings first if your mana can support that, and then this is either an additional thing there, or if you maybe you are like a mono white Taxes deck, for example, and Prismatic Ending isn't ideal, then this gets to compete with stuff like Portable Hole or something instead.
Yeah, you mentioned Portable Hole. I am slightly interested in the prospect of this being a like fairly flexible instant speed answer to again, this is like the disenchant side of the card coming into play, where like you're just getting a little bit more out of that, but it is hard to ask, like, when are you disenchanting something that you aren't going to prismatic ending it? And I think you already have to be at 4 copies of that card to be looking at this. So it's like just like sort of redundancy, and there was a Saga Flex still coming back to that.
Yeah, I could see this just being useful redundancy on prismatic ending, where a lot of the time you have so many good targets for prismatic ending that card is kind of overtaxed. And so against Hammer, for example, if they expose a Sagada's Aid on turn 1, you kind of feel obliged to target it with prismatic ending. But then often the fact that they felt able to expose the first one suggests strongly that they have a second. And so you need some kind of backup there. Or if you do ending the Sagada's Aid, then that clears a way for the Paladin or the Stoneforge Mystic or what have you. And so in that matchup, and any deck that's kind of configured like that, just being able to answer them step for step for the first few turns, that's all you need to do to get to the point in the game where you're more likely to be favored. And I wonder if specifically in the Yorion control decks, so maybe 4-color, but in particular the like blue-white Curryvore deck that we spoke about a few months ago, in that deck, your prismatic endings are even more overtaxed because you just don't see as many of them in an 80-card deck. And so this is a way to replicate that and fill out those last 20 slots without losing too much in terms of functionality there.
Maybe. Can I interest you in a similar card? Not necessarily in like a multicolor deck, but again, in the Curryvore 2-color deck, and that's Banishing Slash. This is the, I guess it's probably not directly in that Curryvore deck, but maybe in like an Ursa deck. This is the white sorcery, destroy an artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. And then if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 Vigilant Samurai. Notably, Ursa Saga activating itself is a artifact and enchantment for a turn. So maybe Banishing Slash is just like too timing dependent to get the full value out of it relative to this. But it feels like they're operating in a similar space, and it might be worth considering either of them for the job.
I do think double white is a big ask as well, even in the strict Azorius control decks. I wonder if that's maybe a card for Hammer more so, where like you have Sagada's A2 as an enchantment, your whole deck is full of artifacts, obviously, and you're a mostly mono white deck, but even there, I think it's just a little too cute, and you'd rather just have the strict efficient card instead.
Yeah, totally fair there.
This does also pair nicely with Squadron Hawk, as does Solitude, but I don't know how many cards like that you would have to print for Squadron Hawk to become playable again, as much as I wish that were the case.
Well, you could have that card on Arena where like you cast it and then your hand turns into all Squadron Hawks. You just have 7 of them or something like that.
Sadly, that card only turns your hand into Suntail Hawks. If it turned it into Squadron Hawks and then each one of them beget more Squadron Hawks, now we're talking. Now we're getting something together.
Yeah. Well, let's let the listeners stew on that for a bit, take a break, and then come back to talk about a white card that is significantly more exciting than Squadron Hawks Forever. This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want a splash of a commander deck? Check out the Keeping It 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Okay, let's round out this batch of previews by starting with the topic of my article from this week, which I'm putting the finishing touches to after we hang up recording here, and that's Lion Sash. So a lot going on equipment on this visit to Kamigawa. This is 1 and a white for an artifact creature equipment cat. It starts as a 1/1. It has the ability white, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, you put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. And then the kicker here is reconfigure 2. So this is, you pay its reconfigure cost, and it's essentially an equip cost. It attaches to target creature you control. And when attached, it isn't a creature. So without that line of text, you would try to equip. You can't equip a creature to another creature, and so nothing would happen. But this is a new rearranging of the rules to allow this to work properly. And to head off the obvious question at the pass here, this does work with both Sagada's Aid and Pure Steel Paladin.
Okay. They have stated that it does work that way. Interesting.
Yes.
I actually like this in the non-Hammer Stoneforge Mystic decks a lot more, just because I think that the primary use of this card, so the one of the trends throughout the years of Modern is this idea of this split between like hard and soft graveyard hate, where like you have Leyline of the Void on one side and like Scavenging Ooze and Relic of Progenitus on the other. And it's like very clear this card is in the like softer graveyard hate category. This is not going to be beating Oops All Spells, I think, unless like you really set up with it and have like a lot of time and mana. This is not going to be beating Dredge because their entire deck operates before this card works. So like this is really mitigating Lurrus in my mind. And against other Lurrus decks with Hammer, I'm not really like trying to win this long grindy game where they cast Lurrus necessarily, even though this, I guess, like shuts off some engineered explosives and dress down loops, which is nice, but like not necessarily the scale I want to be fighting them on. But if I'm with like, you know, playing this like Oswald Stormforge Mystic deck, like this is a slam dunk. I don't have Lurrus. My opponent does. I need to beat their Lurrus. If they don't have cards in their graveyard, they don't have Lurrus. That's done. Also, like, there's this incentive to bring games longer with Lion Sash because against the Lurrus decks, it is at its most exposed when you are like having it as a creature. Whereas if you just have like a random creature on the battlefield that they have managed to not kill, you just play the Sash, equip it. It's protected from whatever like unholy heat that they draw next. It's sort of like you have the ability to give it like a pseudo like hexproof one shot by protecting with whatever creature gets in the way in that case. So I think that I want a deck that plays a little bit longer to maximize it. That said, I would not be shocked to see a copy of it like show up in Hammer or the Nettlecyst Hammer decks anyways, because it's just like relatively good. But I'm much more excited about it in a different deck that is just like a fairer Stoneforge Mystic deck.
I would co-sign all of that. And this is good with Lurrus in the very trivial sense that, well, it costs 2 mana, so you still get to play Lurrus. And it's good against Lurrus in terms of nibbling away at the cards you could recur with Lurrus over time. But in terms of harder graveyard hate, the obvious comparison here is with Scavenging Ooze, which is a card that I don't know has aged so well in Modern in general, but in particular against the really fast linear graveyard decks, you can't rely on a card like Scavenging Ooze or now Lion Sash to be the first relevant play that you take against them. So let's say you're on the play even. I mean, these cards universally get much worse on the draw. Let's say you're on the play against Dredge or Oops, and turn 2, you cast your Stoneforge Mystic, you get this. Turn 3, you play your Lion Sash, and you pass with a white mana open. Depending on, there are some weird edge cases here, but most of the time, the Oops set can power through that. I think if they have any artifact in play already, then there's no hope of like, you eat the third Sword of the Meek that then is exactly enough to stop them from getting the Salvage Titan and getting all the Vengevines and so on. So it's pretty easy for them to power through one single shot graveyard removal. And then against Dredge, yeah, okay, one Price Amalgam is not coming back, but a lot of stuff probably is by that phase in the game. And then any kind of interaction, especially the main deck Dark Blast that a lot of those decks have now is going to spot this out of the way. And so this is a nice addition to your arsenal against those decks, and it gives your Stoneforge Mystic or your artifact tutor card some nice additional functionality, but it can't be your core plan. And so if you expect graveyard decks to be showing up, you cannot afford to cut the Denial Spellbomb for your Ursa Saga or your Sanctifier on Vex that hopefully were in your sideboard to begin with. This is a nice layer on top of that, but it doesn't directly replace any of that by any means. And then the way this card works is actually, it has some clear advantages over traditional equipment, but there is a unique downside here too, where the strength of a card like Cranial Plating or Nettlecyst in Hammer, to use the obvious example there, is that the creatures you want to equip are much harder to remove than the equipment itself is. And so if the equipment is strong enough, it means that it almost doesn't matter what your creatures are past a certain point. All that matters is that you have creatures that you can put the equipment on. And so you put the plating on your Memnite, they have to kill the Memnite. You put the plating on your Ornithopter, they have to kill the Ornithopter. And the hope is, sooner or later, they will run out of removal spells, and the last thing that carries the plating will get the job done. With Lion Sash, it starts as a creature. And so in that window, while it's still a creature and trying to reconfigure itself, they just point their Fatal Push at that, and then it dies, and that dynamic isn't really in play anymore.
Yeah, that, again, the vulnerability as a creature, just really the biggest issue for this card. Anything else to say on this? But there's a couple other cards in this cycle that we should talk about, because it does look like it is a full-ish cycle of these. We've seen 3 total.
Yeah, and there were some interesting other ones to get to as well. I think the other things I would say about this are, I agree that this is more likely a tool for like a mid-rangey Stoneforge Mystic deck, whether that's either of the Aspiring Spike decks that fall into that bucket, like the Oswald deck, or the Fervent Champion deck, which is really cool there too. And I did speculate about what it would take for a fair-ish Pure Steel Paladin deck to become viable, and I don't think this card is what pushes that over the top by itself, but when you have just other good, fair threats that also happen to trigger your Paladin and then get a crit for free with your Paladin, that starts to become much more realistic. And I think one of those cards is maybe what we should get onto next here.
Yeah, well, I'm going to get Lizard Blades out of the way real fast, because I don't like that for this format, but I just love the card in general. Yes. 1 in red, 1/1 double strike. It gives double strikes, reconfigure 2. Not the right rate for modern, because usually if you play your double strike feature, you like aren't trying to level up something bigger, but love it in general. I think the reality chip is really where it's going to shine in modern. I actually think that the reality chip may be better than Lion Sash in this format.
Okay, so the reality chip is 1 in a blue for a legendary artifact creature, Equipment Jellyfish. That's a type line if I've ever saw one here. Notably legendary, so ties into the legendary land cycle that we've spoken about before. And here's its text. Let's go. 04. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as the reality chip is attached to a creature, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, and then reconfigure 2 and a blue. And so if you're able to reconfigure this or just get it attached to a creature somehow, whether it's cheating it in with Paladin or Sigada's Aid, whatever, then you effectively have Future Sight in play. And that is a card whose time has come and gone, but when you get that as part of a larger package at a much cheaper cost, then that really gets me going.
Yeah, no, I really like this card in the blue-red almost combo shells that we've seen a few different iterations of, like Underworld Breach, for example, where you already are probably playing the cheap red creatures to start off because they're enabling your combo. Breach makes you want to play Thought Scour, and like between Thought Scour and fetches in this card, you actually just have card selection because you have access to the knowledge of the top. Yeah.
Hold on. I'm just realizing now, I did observe that Kamigawa preview season is a great time for people who love bad Mox Amber decks, and this works really well with all of my bad Mox Ambers.
Yes, this is exactly where I was going next. I think there are a lot of pieces that really add up to this card being good. It's asking for some specifics of like you have to control other creatures and want to do some other stuff, but like Future Sight is really good, and the innate like shuffling Mishra's Bauble style card selection of this makes the floor relatively low. Relatively high, sorry. Like, just having it as an 0/4 and like fetching every turn, like you're gonna get somewhere pretty fast. And if that anywhere is a creature that you reconfigure it onto, any sort of Izzet deck is going to go off relatively quickly from there. Or, Grixis, it is a 2-drop, it is Lurrus compatible.
That is the equivalent of pitches to Forcible nowadays, right? Like, well, it works with Lurrus. And in this case, it's pretty interesting there, because when you start fitting these puzzle pieces together in, let's say, one of these like artifact-centric breach decks or something, you can see how, well, this probably wants to be an Emery deck. So this is a thing you can recur with Emery or attach to Emery, and then that in turn makes my Mox Hammers a lot better. And if I'm playing Emery, then my curve already is probably quite low, and I have stuff like Mishra's Bauble, which once I'm future sighting, I can just clear the top of my deck pretty rapidly and see a lot of cards in any given turn cycle. And yeah, you start to talk yourself into it, and before long, you're buying Mox Ambers and Emerys and so on, and wondering how you got here. But I wonder if this card could also be kind of the analog to Experimental Frenzy from the 2019 era Affinity decks, which, again, those would really love to have Mox Opal back, and that in turn would make this card even better too. But as it is, attaching that effect to a 2-drop that's also an artifact, like that makes it much easier to get the buy-in there.
Yeah, I actually featured that in a Affinity deck in my most recent article talking about probably the next card we'll get to, Michiko's Reign of Truth, which was playing a small amount of the reality chip. I probably should have considered more, but when you're already like setting up a deck that wants to play Ornithopter, like it's not a huge ask to just play the reality chip as a reasonable card. It's also like not a defender. You could just suit it up with a cranial plating and hit them. It's not the worst thing in the world to do that.
Is there a chance that, bearing in mind this is an equipment, is this part of a blue hammer splash potentially? If you're thinking of configuring yourself for the grindy matchups, as people say, then this was like a great way of doing that.
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about that as a Lurrus compatible Stoneforge Mystic target. That is really awesome.
Yeah.
The more we talk about this card, the more I really think it is one of the like 5-ish best cards that we've seen so far.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and it's a kind of card which maybe just tries to overwhelm you with the sheer volume of its text as opposed to what it's doing. But what it's doing sounds pretty good to me, and I really want this to be good. And it's I think a set succeeds when it has cards like this, which seem potentially very powerful, maybe don't always convert in practice, but you're really excited to fire up whichever deck building program you use and get to work there.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving along to the other card that I mentioned alongside this, Michiko's Reign of Truth. I don't think there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. Like, this is just a really good card for Modern. It is 1 and a white Saga. Chapters 1 and 2 are the same, which is target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment you control. And then chapter 3 is the Saga text from the set where you exile it and it comes back as a construct token, basically. Power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts and enchantments you control. So it counts itself, which is because it is an enchantment on the back side. But I think the thing to note here, and something that really popped out at me as soon as I started just like goldfishing games with it, is first of all, this is just cranial plating, right? It's giving +1 for each artifact you control. That's good math. But the fact that it costs 1 less to effectively, like, when you play plating and equip it, cranial plating costs a total of 3, right? 2 to play, 1 to equip. When you play Michiko's Reign of Truth, it just does that for 2. And that drop off in cost really leads to a lot of more aggressive kills that are approximating some of the Mox Opal draws from the Affinity decks.
Yeah, I know you gave the sequencing with Inkmoth Nexus, where it is pretty scarily easy to just assemble a turn 3 or even turn 4 kill with that card. But worth remembering too that this itself is an enchantment, and the thing you're hoping to target ideally will also be an artifact or enchantment. So that's +2/+2 as a baseline, even before you work in any other cards. And I guess the most direct comparison would be something like All the Glitters for the first 2 modes, except that this is one which you can kind of take it back. If you target something with the first chapter and then that dies, and then you just get to do this again for the second chapter without the inherent vulnerability of auras. And then once this flips, this is going to be one of the biggest things around if your deck is constructed around this card to any degree. And so every part of this seems like a very good output for the cost.
Yeah, big fan of this. Another artifact card that I didn't feature in my article because I hadn't previewed deck yet that is worth considering in these kind of shells is Moonsnare prototype. This is the sort of new Springleaf Drum where it's blue to cast, tap it and an artifact or creature you control for colorless, and then it's got the channel of 4 and a blue where you get to, is it put a permanent on top of it, top or it's the Ether Gust. They choose where it goes, top or bottom. Put a non-land permanent there.
Yes.
I think there is the question of how many Springleaf Drums do you want in a deck? I used to think that the answer was lower, but that was in the Mox Opal era where like you would debate 3 or 4. Springleaf Drum is now kind of one of the more powerful cards in the format, and having your 5th or 6th copies be subsidized in the case of Flood is kind of nice. The 2 things I think pushing back against this card are this kind of weird tension where like early blue goes against the entire premise of Springleaf Drum, which is like you get to play colorless lands and then use Springleaf Drum to produce your colored mana. But I think the other thing is that you almost want to put yourself in a position where the multiple drums are good because you can have access to that with like, 6 copies of Springleaf Drum, 7 copies of Springleaf Drum, even maybe 8. And I think that there comes a point where you don't actually have the low cost fodder. And I think that maybe to do that, this card would need to be paired with like, I don't think Servo Exhibition's the right card, but something along those lines that is producing multiple artifacts for a single card.
Yeah, I think if you want Springleaf Drum, then you want exactly Springleaf Drum, and even the decks which on paper would want the 5th or the 6th Springleaf Drum, and I don't even know what that would be, barring some builds of the new Affinity decks. I think this is enough worse there for the most part that you wouldn't bother with this. What intrigues me here is for the decks which can't really support Springleaf Drum as it stands right now. So things like some kind of Ursa deck potentially where you don't have that many creatures, and so Springleaf Drum maybe is a one-off as like an Ursa Saga target, but otherwise is off limits. But this just, as a thing, which is a good setup piece by virtue of just being an artifact for the cost 1, and then ramps you into either Ursa itself or some of your other bigger stuff. That's and then also is a decent thing to use your Ursa mana on once again. That sounds pretty appealing to me. So I don't know if this mitigates some of the clunkiness of like Thopter Sword, for example, where if you go this into Thopter Foundry and then turn 3, you can either, I guess you can't Whirl of Invention and activate immediately because you're tapping both your things. But if you had a 0-cost artifact, you could still do that. Or you go just this into Foundry, into Sword, and now you're making 2 things instead of 1, which is often the difference between getting to untap and making 5 tokens a turn for the rest of the game, which won't be too long, or just dying on the spot because your one thing gets removed and you're dead. So yeah, I think this card is potentially quite promising, and there are a lot of homes for it which don't know that they need it yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking of something along the lines of the War Prison deck that I played in, what was this, like early 2019, where this is your sort of route to like faster draws as opposed to like the clunky draws that it had, especially because this is, like a 1-mana artifact would let you whir, but like this lets you whir or cast an alternate threat faster. So I'm kind of into that kind of split on this. So maybe less 6 Springleaf Drums and more like 4 Springleaf Drums for the decks that don't play creatures.
Yeah, well, we'll try to get Susterus out of retirement and have him on the podcast as a stretch goal at some point. But for now, we'll try and keep things realistic. And we'll move on to another saga that caught my eye here. This is Hidetsugu Consumes All. This is 1 black-red for a saga. Chapter 1 is destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Chapter 2 is exile all graveyards. And then Chapter 3 is exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control, as is the templating here. And then the other side is just a creature that attacks, and there's some other stuff going on there. But what you're really playing this for is the first chapter, where if there is enough just small stuff littering battlefields in Modern, and there is most of the time, then this is pretty appealing. It sadly is not compatible with Lurrus, and I think that might be what holds it back from showing up in a black-red mid-range sideboard or something, but very good against Lurrus, as it turns out.
Yeah, the specific clause of like, it usually takes them a while to get to Lurrus from the point that this would sweep up like a Ragavan and a Channeler. So actually getting their graveyard before that point is really nice. I also like that this is one of the first things that against Jund Saga, like the problem I've had against Saga with a card like Engineered Explosives is they often have like this weird battlefield spread of like Tarmogoyf, a Construct token, and a Ragavan. This clears like a decent amount of that. I mean, it doesn't clear Ren and Tarmogoyf at the same time, but maybe not Jund, but like if there's like a Rakdos Saga deck, this is a very clean answer to that. So I would keep an eye out for when people get a little too focused on 0 and 1s here. Specifically, again, like I said, Saga layered with Ragavan, this card is a very clean answer to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we still have some interesting ones to get to here. So let's get another saga off our list. This is Restoration of Aiganjo. This is 2 and a white for... hold on, I need to drag this one up on the spoiler here. This was previewed as of, I think, 2 or 3 hours ago. So doing it live. Chapter 1 is... If you can fill in from memory, then bail me out by all means.
I got it up. It's 2 and a white saga. Chapter 1 is search your library for a basic plains, put it into your hand, shuffle. Chapter 2 is you may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I missed that word the first time. And then Chapter 3, it transforms into a 3/4 vigilance that whenever it attacks or blocks, you make a spirit token. So it's somehow a more interesting Burmaz by being really slow about it. I don't quite know. What are your thoughts here?
See, I kind of like what's going on here, but I don't know what that is yet. I don't know what this card is meant to go in, other than like the the Sun Titan decks that people really enjoyed playing back in the day. It's almost like a delayed gratification for Renegade Rallier, which in turn makes it a little bit easier to set up, potentially. It is worth noting that the card that you discard, you can just discard the planes that you search for with the first chapter and then get that back. So the base case is a very slow ramp spell that then gets you the 3/4 backside. But unless I have something very clear in mind to get back with chapter 2, then this seems like a lot of work for not much reward.
Can I I guess Ursa Saga is a card there. I also am kind of interested in this is probably a little slow in terms of Sagas doing this, but the way these cards play with Flicker Wisp is kind of interesting, where you can get a creature, get into the combat stage, portion of the game, and then once you get to the point where things that they bog down, you can regain some value if the creature becomes irrelevant. Maybe that might be asking a lot of different conditions. That might be a discussion for a different format, but it is interesting to note that you can reset the creature back into the saga that way.
Yeah, I guess it would have to be some bigger white mid-range deck, but again, how does that even... Maybe the Oswald deck, honestly, where you have a bunch of really good 2-drops, but even, I don't know, there still just seems like a lot of hoops to jump through. I want to love this card, and I will in maybe smaller formats or in some casual cube context, but I think for modern, it just isn't really priced to move.
Yeah, it's kind of, this might be, so I know April King had tweeted something about mentioning how these cards double trigger Constellation, where they enter the battlefield and you get the Constellation trigger and they flicker and come back. This feels like one of the cards that is actually layering Constellation triggers really well, because it actually generates potentially 3 over 3 turns, right? 1 on the first turn, you discard, get back an enchantment, there's 1 on the second turn, and then it flickers on the third turn. So depending on how good your Constellation triggers are, it might be worth it to use this card to really maximize that.
Okay, that is the actual use case, I think, because thinking through this now, let's say we have a typical Enchantress deck. We can either curve, let's say, turn 2 Sithis. That's a lightning rod. They have to remove it if they can. And then that gives me a high impact 2-drop where once I return this on turn 4 with the second chapter, I now have all my mana open to cast enchantments to keep triggering my Sithis and go from there. Or I can, let's say, Utopia Sprawl into this on 2. For the second chapter, I discard my Sithis and put it into play, and now I'm back in that same spot. If I have all my mana to play with and can just start chaining spells together and going off. So, and that doesn't have to be Sithis exactly. It can be other things. This can buy back a Sterling Grove, for example, in a longer game, or a Seal of Cleansing, something like that. So, okay, I think that might be the exact home that this card wants, actually.
Yeah, that actually all sounds really awesome. And I did learn that Sithis is legal and historic, so keep that in mind for all of you Arena players. I just wanted to drop that knowledge into everyone's brain, because even if Sithis doesn't see a lot of play in Modern right now, I think it is interesting to see that card get access in other formats, because it's one of the more it's pushed in a weird way from Modern Horizons 2, where it's pushed in a way that might not make it Modern compatible, but it feels like a Modern card. I don't know. I just want to see some Sithis out there in the world, and this is a great way to do that.
Here's another thought, actually. So one deck that often does feature a single Sithis in its 80 cards is the Enigmatic Incarnation deck that we've featured at least once in Nonsense of the Week, and possibly more. And this actually seems like a pretty nice card in that shell as well, because you have a lot of good 2-mana enchantments to work with, and then also some creatures that, Sithis or other stuff, which if you're trying to turn your Utopia Sprawls and Abundant Growths into 2-drops, then this can buy back all of those 2-drops. This can get back the one Meddling Mage or something that they had to kill, because if they didn't, they can't do their thing anymore.
Okay, you sold me on this, just describing the nonsense of it, but it's one of those things where my first reaction of oh no is probably the correct one, but you should probably play this card if you're going to play Enigmatic Incarnation. That is correct.
Or, okay, hear me out. You Spreading Seas that Ursa Saga, and then the Spreading Seas go to the graveyard because it's done its job, but it's not done just yet because Chapter 2 rolls around, and you can see where this is going.
Yeah, okay, that also makes sense. I want to look up, I'm trying to remember what the Modern list of this deck had, because I feel like there's additional interactions that are involved. Okay, so Wrenn and 6 can be recurred. That's cool. Dress Down and Seal of Fire or other things sort of recur. That there's a lot of cute stuff going on there. You can make it work.
Yeah.
you can recur a fetch land that gets you something other than the basic planes. I guess it's tap, so that's kind of janky, but I guess it's close enough.
Yeah, the Spreading Seas or the Render Six does enter tap, so worth keeping that in mind. But, if you're trying to be technically correct here.
Yeah, they can exile your tapped enchantment with, you know what, that's fine. We'll move on from that. What's the next card we have on this list?
So our next card is Secluded Courtyard. So this is unclaimed territory with an upside here. So when it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. This can tap for colorless, this can tap for any color, and you can use that to cast a creature of the chosen type or to activate an ability from a creature of the chosen type. So basically a strict upgrade to unclaimed territory, but that's not really the exciting part. So if somehow your deck only wanted 4 of this effect, or I guess 8 in conjunction with Cavern of Souls, then okay, you get to upgrade half of those. Or if your deck only wanted Cavern of Souls, then this is a very good budget addition to the format if you're trying to build 5-color humans, for example. But I think the more likely thing is if your deck wants as many of these as it can get its hands on, the full 12 or even more, then this is another 4 copies of that effect. So some of the more obscure tribes can kind of get there already. So Slivers has Sliver Hive, or there's Ally Encampment or Primal Beyond or what have you. But there might be other tribes out there where just having the 12 unconditional rainbow lands, even before you get into things like Ancient Ziggurat or whatever, that might be enough to broaden their horizon, so to speak.
Yeah, well, you never have to draw the stupid Ancient Ziggurat Ether Vial hand ever again in your life, which was the worst part of humans when that was one of the best decks in the format. You mentioned Primal Beyond, and that is the other one of these that lets you activate abilities. I just wanted to make sure and go through all the different ones. So there is a chance that the 5-color Elementals deck does have access to some activated abilities that it might not have before. I kind of doubt it because I think the Risen Reef stuff there kind of made the mana work anyways, but it's worth noting.
Here's the sad thing there is the ability you really want is the one on Horde of Notions. The problem is you need all 5 colors of that, and the inferior rainbow lands like Territory or Cavern of Souls don't contribute towards that. So it's basically a pipe dream to ever activate that, even with whatever help this is giving you on that front.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. Yeah, I don't really think the ability clause is going to come up. I guess it does let you activate Sedge Sliver. I don't know. But I think that just having 12 of this that let you cast Ether Vial is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. So I don't know. I can't actually think of any other abilities which would make you really actively want this over an unclaimed territory or something, but worth keeping in mind and just a great addition to the format at large. Let's talk about Tameshi. So this is a very funky one. I want to make sure I have this right here. So Tameshi Reality Architect is 2 and a blue for a legendary Merfolk Wizard. It's a 2/3. Whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then X and a white, return a land you control to its owner's hand. Return as a cost. Return target artifact or enchantment card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So that one is kind of hard to pass, especially in an audio medium. So if you're able to, I recommend looking that one up on Mythic Spoiler, Scryfall, or anything like that. And just feasting your eyes upon this, because there's clearly something going on here, but it's going to take a while to figure it out.
Yeah, so I do want to correct you. Sadly, it's Moonfolk, not Merfolk, I believe you said. So you cannot, do the full tribal Harbinger of the Tides thing. But the thing that popped out with this card to me is there's 2 things. One is you can pay a white to return a land to your hand to return a Lotus Bloom from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is pretty great. And then you draw a card the first time that happens a turn. Also really great. And then there's also this sort of end game that this card enables with I'm trying to remember the exact config because I thought this up and it immediately fell out of my brain because I'm just you're never going to realistically assemble this, but it is an actual way you can win the game in the end, which is if you have a way to discard an artifact land for profit and then convert the colorless mana that it taps for to white, you actually generate a loop where you bounce the artifact land, paying the white that you made off of tapping it, and then discard it. And the thing that it returned is a different artifact land, and it returns untapped. So you just get to keep looping through this. Again, like I said, this is a really convoluted thing, but it's the kind of thing that once you have Tameshi'd and put your entire deck into your hand can just be this is your win condition with cards that you would have already played.
Yeah, maybe there's some like weird Artificer's Intuition setup you can do here to tie that room together. You can't get an untapped artifact land that taps for white, because all of those are, the Mirrodin ones are banned, and then the MH2 ones all come into play tapped. But maybe this is where you have like a 1 Amulet of Vigor for your Artificer's Intuition or your Word of Invention or something, and then that lets you set up a loop with a blue-white bridge, or I don't know. You can go deep down the rabbit hole here. I think the more obvious application is just pick up something, return Ursa Saga, and you can do that every single turn, and potentially the Ursa Saga can be the land that you have returned. You can only do it as a sorcery, so you can't do the trick of with the third chapter on the stack, pick it up and get some profit from that. But I can imagine you wanting to, get the first construct making ability from this, and then maybe that's your only Ursa Saga. You don't think Tameshi is long for this world. You can just pick the saga up, get something back in the process, replay it again. Or once your first saga has, you've got everything you can from it, you play Tameshi, you immediately pick up a different land, you return the saga, and now you have that and Tameshi both as pretty substantial threats that have to be dealt with.
Yep. Also very good with Ether Spellbomb. You bounce on their turn and your turn. Oh wow, that's So yeah, that gives you the ability to get like both halves of the turn cycle to get a trigger there, and then also the Tameshi or the Spellbomb, which could be the thing you get with the third chapter of your saga, is this layer of protection for Tameshi at the same time. Yep. Also good with Spellskite protecting itself. The other thing I saw was that Treasure Vault, you don't have to pay. It costs, like, you can activate it for 0 treasures. So that's just like an artifact that can naturally end up in your graveyard that is relatively low cost to include. I think there's just like a lot of stuff going on here for a card that, like, it feels like it's really weird that it's an uncapped number of times that you can return something per turn from your graveyard. That feels like the kind of thing that will get eventually abused.
Especially as nowadays, it feels like they are very diligent about putting those kind of safety valves on cards where so many things can only trigger once each turn. Like that specific line of text. I mean, you see it on the first half of Tameshi, right? Like you don't get to endlessly draw your deck, but you do get to endlessly loop with the second half of this. And that's the part that seems really breakable to me. The first part is just all upside. And I can actually imagine being so caught up in the like funky loops I'm creating here that I just straight up forget to draw a card, like Mrs. Bauble style.
Yeah, I'm pretty into this card. It's going somewhere, but I don't know where it is.
Yeah, and that is going to be the first thing I want to figure out when the set releases, I think. Let's talk about another artifact-centric blue card with a lot of text here too, to close out this batch of previews. This is Tezzeret Betrayer of Flesh. So it's 2 blue for a legendary planeswalker, Tezzeret. Starts with 4 loyalty. It has a static ability of the first activated ability of an artifact you activate each turn costs 2 generic mana less to activate. And then its loyalty abilities are +1, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 unless you discard an artifact. So like a mini Thirst for Knowledge there. -2, target artifact becomes an artifact creature permanently. If it isn't a vehicle, it has base power and toughness 4/4, so kind of analogous to the Tezzeret Agent of Bolus, -1 there, or Blackstaff and Soul Artifact, things in that space. And then the -6, you get an emblem with whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. I'm not quite sure, to return to our Tameshi discussion, if a thing entering tapped would trigger that. Like if you play a blue-white bridge from your hand, would that draw you a card? Either way, that's a very remote corner case, and if you have to ask that question, that's probably a good problem to have. I think there's a lot going on here which maybe doesn't get you there for 4 mana in Modern, especially when Urza is kind of competing in that same space as well, but there's a lot to love about this card.
Yeah, I think that actually you're more likely to deck yourself with the whenever an artifact becomes tapped ability, but you probably do win the game before decking. Probably. Yeah, I think that this card competing with Urza in a lot of ways is interesting, but I think there's room for decks to play more than 4 copies of a Urza-like effect. Similar to Tameshi, I'm interested in ways that you get to use the activated ability reduction on both your turn and their turn. I mean, like, that is the reason to play this card, right? Is to be able to, like, get mana out of it in a sort of Urza-esque way immediately.
Yeah.
Do you have ideas for ways to really abuse that?
I have some. That hadn't actually occurred to me. The fact you can do that on each turn as well. So they're definitely worth paying attention to that. Also, with the Ursa point, just quickly, in one sense, they compete with each other. In another sense, though, once you have these two very strong payoffs of 4 mana that kind of overlap in what they want you to do, that really incentivizes you to build your deck around just having one of those. And maybe it doesn't even matter too much which one it is a lot of the time, but it is much easier to have a bunch of, I don't know, Mind Stones or Ever-Flowing Chalices or whatever in your deck when just getting to 4 is what you most care about. One way to jump to 4 is the Signets, which haven't seen much play in Modern, and especially as 1-drops become more important, you're basically always going to want the Talisman in your color pair over the Signet. That being said, once you have Tezzeret in play, the templating on the Signets is 1 and a tap to add the color pair. That becomes just tap to add the color pair. And so your Signets now tap for 2 mana without needing any kind of input on the front end. So that's interesting. Mind Stone cycles itself for free, as do the Spell Bombs, Brainstone if you have any interest in that. Treasure Vault, you get an extra treasure out of the bargain there. Walking Ballista can charge itself for 2 mana, and I guess you could do that once on each turn as well. Maze Mind Tome is a card in that space. Engineered Explosives can sacrifice itself for free, which is pretty interesting because usually you're not getting a great deal there if you have to pay a bunch of mana for the X and then the 2 to sacrifice. If it is just X, blow up everything that costs X, well, that's a bargain. And then the one that caught my eye, and this is a blast from the past, we haven't seen this one in a while, is Vidalcan Shackles, where just maintaining the threat of that card at instant speed makes it so difficult to just do anything with creatures, let alone attack Tezzeret in combat or anything. And the fact that you now have the threat of that looming for free at all times makes it so much easier to justify putting that card in your deck. Still kind of tough to justify doing that on the whole, but I would like to believe at least.
Can I interest you? You mentioned a bunch of things that are reduced in these like one-shot ways. I think you missed Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star as things that you can activate as free mana bursts after Tezzeret resolves.
Well, that too. I'm definitely in for that.
Only the first time, so there's a limit, but
yes. Yeah. There's some overlap there with the cards you want to play with Kinnan as well. Like that's another card which is brimming with a lot of dangerous potential, but that hasn't really been realized yet. And actually, that was a card I wanted to mention in conjunction with the Springleaf Drum analog from this set. So maybe there's something in that space you can do. And trying to piece this together in my head, probably worth doing after we wrap up here. But that whole brand of card, like Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star, they pair very well here. Is there anything else that comes to mind off the top of your head?
Unfortunately, the Gatherer wheel, the page just loading forever. So I can't do that. I don't know how to Scryfall search for a activated ability : in the middle. It breaks all the syntax. So I'll get back to you on that in a little bit. Nothing that immediately comes to mind in terms of like good things to reduce the cost of abilities on.
Yeah, that's kind of a thorny regex query to try and assemble there. But Godspeed to whoever can do that. And I think that it's tough to, like, 4 mana is a lot in Modern, right? And we've said, especially in this MH2 world where there's so much incentive to keep your curve low and be as efficient as possible. I like that cards like this can exist and make me want to break outside of that paradigm and to do it maybe in conjunction with other cards that cost a similar amount of mana, like Ursa. I guess another thing that stands out, if we're talking about stuff you want to pair with Ursa, is the Thopter Sword combo. Now you can activate for the first time, like once on each turn for free, potentially. So usually if you have Thopter Sword and a bunch of mana like that, that's good enough. You don't need to add anything on. But the fact that you can play the Tezzeret then and kind of get this partial rebate is kind of nice there too.
Yeah, I think there's a question about whether you want to pair this with like as like a combo setup or like just getting some equity out of it. There's just like a lot of stuff you can do with the activated ability part of this card that's probably like the biggest puzzle to solve, because once you cast it, it's largely just like drawing a lot of cards or making things that attack. I think that's the real thinker part of it.
One other thing you can do is you can pair this with Nettle Cyst, because Nettle Cyst costs 2 to equip, so that becomes free essentially, and Tezzeret can turn something else into a creature. So one line you might see is, I play Tezzeret, I -2, I make my Mishra's Bauble, let's say, into a 4/4, equip Tezzeret to it for free, and it's now massive, and and I'm off to the races there too. So I don't know. I imagine that deck, like we've seen builds of that which could have played Urza before and chose not to, and that's a pretty bold statement in and of itself. But if you're in the market for a 4-drop, then Tezzeret can kind of mimic some of that at the same time.
Yeah, I got the search working, but sadly it is a very large one, and the only card that I found so far that I'm interested in out of the first like 200 cards is not in this format. It is unfortunately Retrofitter Foundry, which is
God.
Listen, the legacy players are going to have a field day.
Oh, I want to do that right now. God.
Wait, this reduces the cost of clues.
Okay, interesting.
That's actually like a really interesting one, is that it lets you convert like clues and food and stuff for free. Which
blood tokens too. Yeah.
I guess that all like gets involved in like the weird Academy manufacture stuff.
Yeah, and hey, if you have a bunch of those around, that's a lot of things which you can -2 to turn into 4/4s. Do you just have a random food token syncing up the joint, and you get to do that? You get to turn that into something useful now.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of artifacts with activated abilities that both you, I, the listeners, everybody can kind of go through this list of 1,261 cards which have an activated ability in the card type artifact and try and find the best thing to do with them. But until we get lost in the sauce of the future nonsense, let's kick it over to the nonsense that does exist this week, today in the Magic Online leagues. And we get to talk to you about some, excuse me? Let's take a break and we'll come back to these.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' own Cube podcast, where each week myself and Ryan Sachs discuss anything and everything Cube Draft. From the perspective of Cube designers and drafters alike, we're tackling topics like deep dives into specific archetypes, Cube reviews for new sets as they release, and offering general insights for anybody interested in Magic's greatest format. Whether you're a seasoned Cube drafter or you haven't dipped your toes into the wonderful world of Cube just yet, I think you'll find the listen worth your time. Check out the 540 right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, let's pick it up with various flavors of Nonsense of the Week. And that exclamation that you sent us off with really could apply to any one of these decks in their own ways.
See, it was the presence of Plax Manta was the one that got me. For those who have not heard of Plax Manta, it is an all-star from a standard format long past. Actually, I believe it was prevalent in the last standard format that played with Kamigawa cards. It was a 1 and a blue 2/2 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain Shroud until end of turn, and then if you didn't play green to play it, you sacrifice it. So it was in these like teamer tempo decks with Curdape, and I guess this is the spiritual successor to that. This is a Sign of Draco territorial Kavu deck with Plax Manas in the sideboard, and I believe we've seen approximately this. I don't recall the Plax Manas before, and that is a nice touch.
Yeah, it was the Spell Starter Sprites in the main deck that hooked me in, and then the Plax Mantas in the sideboard were just gravy on top of that. So yeah, getting some real Sea Stompy vibes from this one, and sadly we're not picking up our Plax Mantas or our Spell Starter Sprites with Ninja the D-Powers or anything like that, but maybe there will be some Ninja in this set that makes that play pattern worth investigating again.
Very possible. I think there is a cheap one that we missed that's like a 2-drop looter. That might be more of a pop kind of thing, but certainly interesting to consider for future Plax Manta applications. Let's talk about the one that's more in your wheelhouse. I'll let you take this other deck over real fast.
I do just want to shout out the one Piracy Charm in the main deck here, where it slices, it dices, it gives Island Walk, it pitches to Force Negation and to Subtlety, just does it all. Lets Ragavan become unblockable temporarily, just love it. But as you say, we do have another deck to get to here, and that is Amulet, but it's not your grandfather's Amulet deck. This is Amulet with Heartless Summoning alongside Dread Presence and the Gitrog monster. So Dread Presence is an M20 card, 3 in a black for a 3/3. Whenever a swamp ETBs under your control, you get to either draw a card and lose 1 life, or shoot something for 2 and gain 2 life. And so we've seen various decks in smaller formats, casual formats pair this with Urborg famously, but as we'll recall, Amulet already really wants to play Dryad of the Elysian Grove. And so with that making every single land a swamp, well, now Dryad and Dread Presence together, any land or any fetch land becomes 2 triggers. You really just get to go off, draw a bunch of cards, shoot down everything on the battlefield. Very Valakut-esque in that sense. And so you look at the mana base and you have 3 Urborgs side by side with the 2 copies of Valakut. All of this being fueled by Heartless Summoning, 1 and a black. Creature spells you cast cost 2 less, but then creatures you control get -1/-1. And so this is a way to ramp into Primeval Titan on turn 4 with no additional effort. Dryad costs 1 now. Dread Presence costs 2. And also, the Gitrog monster costs 3. And if you're if you're a fan of the Gitrog monster, I think this is the deck for you. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, I really, really just appreciate, as you mentioned, side by side. No, like literally, if you alphabetize the lands go 2 Talaria West, 3 Urborg, 2 Valakut. I just really appreciate that small touch.
Yeah, and then 3 Verdant Catacombs with no mountains in the deck for your Valakuts, like 2 actual swamps. Just the whole mana base here really is a delight.
Yeah, this is really something else. Handwear Battlement's still finding its way in. I appreciate the effort to the bit here, and we still have room for our Royal Grazers, so good stuff.
But what you see, the Handwear Battlements is kind of a necessity if you're doing the Amulet Primeval Titan thing. The real kicker is it's not the whole Slayer Stronghold Sunhome nonsense, because that takes up extra slots, and we're already cutting down to 29 lands here to make room for a bunch of random creatures and our Heartless Summonings. Something has to give, and in the mana base, we have to find room for our 3 Urborgs, among other things. And so, what are you going to do with those extra slots?
Yeah, you have to cut Ursa Saga to make this happen, so you better be sure you want to pay that price.
I hadn't even realized that was going on here. I think if you forced me to play this deck, I would just cut some of the other random green creatures from this creature base to add some Ursa Sagas, but, I can't have any hate for this approach.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really cut those when you need things to actually cast off your Heartless Summoning, because they do all survive. I am kind of into Tireless Tracker plus Heartless Summoning in a weird way, but that might just be getting way too cute.
I mean, how about Tireless Provisioner plus Heartless Summoning?
Is that better? I actually don't even know.
I guess it depends, right? Like, it does a good Lotus Cobra impression. So if you go turn 2 Summoning, turn 3, cast Provisioner for 1, play a fetch land, make a treasure, crack it, get another treasure. Yeah, that's 4 mana. You can just cast a Titan.
I had not considered that exact lineup. That is very exciting.
And then the Titan gets you 2 more lands, which in turn gives you your choice of some permutation of food and treasure on the back end. So, there's a lot of game actions being taken here.
Yeah, that is a rather explosive setup. And though that does make me kind of wonder if Tireless Provisioner is almost in range of normal Amulet decks.
Maybe we just broke it right here. And, we memed ourselves into discovering the truth. Yeah,
you can tutor for, I guess it's probably worse than Azusa in most cases, but not necessarily.
Anyway, moving on to another deck here, which really is a fan of taking game actions. This is a Asmo Urza Reanimator deck. So this has the Asmo Cookbook with the Persist Archon crossover that we featured in the past. We've got Oval Chase Daredevil as the card that you love to pair with Cookbook. We've got some Thought Monitors here, which is a backup persist target, among other things, if you can't cast that card manually. But then we also have Voldaren Epicure as part of this little blood package tying the room together here, where that can help you to just deposit the Archon in the graveyard. It gives you a blood token, which you can cash in to discard anything to then just play Asmo in lieu of having Street Wraith or anything like that. And you're an artifact deck, you've got Ursa Saga, you want to reduce the cost of your Thought Monitor, and so just anything that makes an artifact really helps to do all of that. And so the 7 blood cards, kind of these innocuous additions to the format from Crimson Vow, but I think there will be some deck, whether it's this or your Vampires deck, which I hope there's some exciting update on. Something in that space, I think, is going to be interesting.
Voldaren Epicure is, in fact, the future of Modern. You have heard it here first and may hear it here again before it's the truth. But it is, in fact, the future of the format.
Yeah, that needs to be the title of this episode. That's the kind of clickbait we need to get any eyeballs on our stuff these days.
Yeah, maybe let's stick to Kamigawa stuff for now, because that is a rather important set coming out. But I would love to actually have the Voltaren Epicure as the future of the format at a later time.
We'll keep that one in the chamber until the time is right. For now, though, I think the time is right to wrap all of this up. Fantastic start, honestly, to the Kamigawa preview season. I think back again to my first Kamigawa preview season where there was exactly two playable cards. There was Pithing Needle, which has been reprinted like a dozen times since then, and a Borrow, which is not even in like the top 5 legendary Kamigawa lands anymore. And that was it. That's the entire yield from that set. And now we have a whole bounty of goodies to play with. And I'm really excited to play with some of these cards and see what the rest of the set has to offer too.
Yeah, I can't believe you would disrespect Kataki like that, but also really not from that set. Feels like it's not a Savior's card at all.
Yeah,
but
that one could have used that one a year ago, but yeah.
Yeah, I am sure we have made progress from Saviors, and this set does feel like it is hitting in the right spot, similar to kind of like how Midnight Hunt was, where there's a lot of interesting, weird stuff. You don't exactly know what's going to happen with it, but it's not like anything is out of line. It's just right in line for what we're considering. All these reality chips and things like that feel like they should have an important place in the format, but yet aren't quite a whole deck on their own. And I think that's a really good spot for a standard release to have in terms of modern impact.
Absolutely. As someone who has an incentive to dive into both Alchemy and Historic over the next few weeks, I think Kamigawa is poised to shake up those formats, and both of those formats could do with that at this point. So excited to see what is in store there. Until then, and until everything else, you can find me on Twitter at Dominaria. You can find Ari on Twitter at ARMLX. You can find our written thoughts on many of these cards in more detail this week and over the upcoming weeks over at StarCityGames.com. And that will do it. So until next time, we will see you all then. Take care.